Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to speak with you about why we think our spiritual teachers are perfect. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a gloss of a evolutionary biological and Western psychological perspective as it relates to power hierarchies, power generally, and power dynamics, specifically in the context of spiritual communities. It is natural in all power relationships for people in the down power position, in the case of spiritual communities, that's students, to project out what? Safety, agency, and spiritual authority onto the spiritual teacher. Again, this happens in any power relationship, minus the spiritual authority part. That is unique to spiritual communities of any kind. And this very natural tendency to project is actually moving towards healing and integration. But it's very easy to get lost, right? It very easily loses itself when spiritual teachers, students, and the community as a whole don't have a deep understanding that these dynamics exist. If they do, how to work with them effectively so that they can lead to the healing and integration that they're looking for. So, like I said, I was going to give a brief gloss, and I did. There's a lot there, and all of that deserves its own video, and it will get it. But I'm going to spend the bulk of this video talking about something else. Just know that this evolutionary biological and Western psychological perspective is here in the mix, and it's very important in regards to answering the question why we think our spiritual teachers are perfect. Let's move to what I want to talk about mostly today, and that is, for thousands of years, human beings' tendency to fuse or conflate the mythological and the historical, or the spiritually ideal and the human. Let's take an example. Gautama Buddha, or the historical Buddha. What do we know about him? He likely lived between 480 to 400 BCE, before Common Era. He was part of an aristocratic clan. Encountering existential suffering became part of the Shramana movement, which was a philosophical and spiritual movement of the time that was in direct contrast to Vedic Brahmanism. Within the context of that movement, he experienced a great enlightenment and began teaching. And he taught things like no self, dependent origination, the middle path, Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path. All of those teachings can be traced back to the historical Buddha. What has been mythologized, right? I talked about our tendency for thousands of years as human beings to fuse or conflate the mythological and the historical. So I just gave you a historical overview of the Buddha, but we have also received many myths. And what are those? That he was born the prince of a royal dynasty, that his father received a prophecy before he was born that he would either be a great leader of that dynasty or become a spiritual teacher of great power, that he was then asked to or demanded to stay within the walls of the palace, that one day he broke that and went out into the larger city, saw old age, sickness, death, and a spiritual ascetic, and being so confronted by human suffering, decided to leave his place in the palace and go become a spiritual teacher. All of that is, or a spiritual aspirant rather, all of that is later mythological overlay. There are other pieces of mythological overlay that are perhaps a little more obvious, miraculous birth stories, like he immediately began to walk upon being born, signs of his awakening, that upon his enlightenment, earthquakes took place, and so on. All of these are retroactive mythological overlays onto a historical person of great spiritual power and significance. So here is that tendency to conflate. And it's very, very important because we see it coming down the line. You see it with Yeshua, the Nazarene, right? Jesus of Nazareth. Similarly, we have a historical figure, clearly a human being of great spiritual power, mythologized to become the singular Son of God, dying for all of the world's sins and those who would accept him into their heart. You also see it in what we call hagiographies. And this is biographies of saints that begin to list all of their many miracles. Again, miraculous birth stories and upbringings and so on. It's a very, very deep tendency in our human consciousness to fuse the mythological and the historical. And it doesn't just stop in religious milieus. We know, looking back historically, that there were emperors in China, that there were leaders in the Middle East, that there were Roman emperors who also believed themselves to be kinds of demigods. And perhaps some of their subjects did as well. So this tendency to conflate the historical and the mythological, the spiritually ideal and the human, doesn't just happen in religious milieus, it happens in political ones as well. But as we come into our current time, in most politics, we don't make that conflation between our political leaders and their human selves anymore. In fact, maybe just the opposite. But we do still do that with our spiritual teachers. And it's not our faults. It's a deep tendency in human consciousness, just like projection, to make this kind of conflation. Because there is truth in mythological modes of consciousness. For instance, to say that upon the Buddha's awakening experience that the whole earth shook is not a historical fact, but it is a mythological truth. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the whole world shook in that it changed the course of history, right? And if you can see, when we say that the whole world shook, that earthquakes took place, it mediates experientially the significance of the event. And so let's be very clear. Mythological modes of being are not a problem. They are necessary and incredibly valuable. I'd like to see them enacted consciously in many more domains of our world because we need them. They're powerful vehicles for transmission. But I believe in the time that we live in, we are being called to parse out that mythological mode of consciousness, that spiritually ideal mode of consciousness, and the historical and the kind of current messy human affairs. And to hold these more closely together, which I'm going to do a whole video on. This video was to just give you an account for why we think our spiritual teachers are perfect and how we are still living within a tendency to fuse the mythological and the historical, or again, the spiritually ideal and the human that we project on to our spiritual teachers still, that because they are abiding in awakened states of consciousness and have some capacity to transmit those states, maybe very powerfully, that they are also paragons of virtue, or that they can do no wrong, or are perhaps perfect in other ways. What are we doing there, right? we are unnecessarily conflating or fusing that kind of mythological and human aspect. And we want to parse those out in a way that we can be more mature spiritual students, that our teachers can be more mature spiritual teachers, and that we can live within more mature spiritual communities that have the ability to be a container for the light of awakening, the force of evolution, but also of the honest and humble human healing and integration and living and complexification that's seeking to take place in every moment. So there you go. That is some of my take on why we think our spiritual teachers are perfect. And again, a kind of call to action as to what we are to do in this time. And that's to parse these things out, the mythological, the historical, the spiritually ideal, and the human, to be able to appreciate both modes and to allow them to coexist without conflating them, without fusing them, because that gets us into a lot of unnecessary messes. All right. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested to learn more about me and my services as a psycho-spiritual counselor, you can find my website linked in the description below. Thank you for your time and attention. You take good care, and I hope to see you next time.